It's like going back to famine times. And I speak to people, I say, no matter what goes on. I can remember flying with gold someplace over the Nile, and they pointed down to a house in the Blue Nile, maybe what looked like 100 miles away, and somebody said, there's an Irish priest down there. I was in the Amazon. Somebody told me there's an Irish missionary nun there, an Irish missionary priest, every place in Africa. I'm going to tell you one story, and then I'm going to get on to the Philippines. But about 8 or 9 years ago, I found myself, a little longer, I found myself in an extraordinary place for me personally. I found myself on the pulpit of the church in Mount Merion, because I'd been asked to do something, because I'd done a story for RTE about a missionary nun who was helping out AIDS workers I think it was in Zaire. And as a result of that story, a whole lot of money came flooding in. And I was asked to go up on a Sunday and speak about what I had seen. And it was just absolutely fantastic to be standing up there talking about the good work. And equally for me tonight, it is just absolutely brilliant. When I got the phone call, I could not be happier. In one sense, the story of the Negros Nine, of Niall O'Brien, Brian Gore, Vicente Dangan, and the other 6, it deserves far more, because it is a symbol of what was good, of what was really good in the church. And that should really be shouted out more. I can remember the January night. I was a young reporter. I joined RTE in 1974. I'd never been in an aeroplane in my life in 1974. Never. I didn't know what the inside of an airplane looked like. So by 1980, I'd been to a few places. It wasn't my first big story. The big story in one sense that changed my life, or for me personally, was the Stardust fire in 1982. But in terms of something happening to me going abroad, it was certainly going to the Philippines. And my boss, I'm not certain, Niall O'Brien says that it was John Bowman, he was on the air with John Bowman, but on the morning programme, but I think on the news at 1:30, he was back on being interviewed by Fintan Drury at the time. And whatever happened in the story, Niall O'Brien was asked, you're up on a murder charge, if you were found guilty, what would happen? And the answer came, well, probably we'd be executed. So all of a sudden in the RTE newsroom, there was hold on, think about it. Irish missionary priest in the Philippines. So by 6 o'clock that evening, the story was on the 6th. I wasn't even doing it, but I remember about 6:20 being called into. He was the managing editor of television news, a Kerryman, Rory O'Connor, who had a broad Knocknagoshel accent, and he called me Charles. And he said, Charles, we're sending you to the Philippines to do this story about this Irish priest who's out there. I hadn't a clue. Not an iota where the Philippines was. I tell you, I was obviously excited because all reporters, young or old, they want to be at the story. And here was I, all of a sudden being dropped in my lap. Irish priest, Australian priest, 7 others facing death in the Philippines, a trial. And I was told to go to the Philippines. The next day I flew, to Paris and then Air France, and eventually ended up in Manila. I'm not certain who met me at the airport. I am not certain who met me at the airport. But the one thing I will never ever forget, it was ringed with tanks and soldiers. Because what was happening in the Philippines at the time, that was the symbol. The airport was ringed. And it was taken into the Columban House in Manila, and I stayed there overnight. And the next day, for those of you who know, Mark, all of you who know the Philippines and the flight to Bacolod, it was in the evening time, electrical storms, it was like something for me. Again, I'm trying to explain, I was a young kid. This is my first story. And I was sitting there in this plane on my way to a place called Bacolod in Negros. And eventually got there. We used to stay in a place called the Sea Breeze Hotel. Again, for those of you who know it, it is a remarkable place. It was right smack at the end or the beginning of this runway. And it was a ramshackled hotel. Donny spoke about the prison. I'm going to tell you, the provincial prison in Becolid, he was right. It was a stockade. To me, it was like a stockade. It was going back 100 years. Outside, you got in, and inside families were cooking pots and food for the prisoners who were inside again. And it was just absolutely remarkable. But the Sea Breeze Hotel was one of these places. So my first journey was down to Cabancalan. And I've seen a number of faces here tonight. Mark, Tony and others, which make me really happy. Because it's fantastic. But I got to tell you, I don't know the many people in this room, but my best mate, I have to tell you, I'm going to be in trouble. He wasn't a Columban. He was a Redemptorist. And I think you know who I mean. Frankie Connon. He was the most remarkable, and I mean the most remarkable human being that I've ever met. He was brilliant. He was just one of those people. And he stuck like glue to Niall and to Brian and to everything that was happening to the Negros Nile. He was a character. He had a fag in his mouth. There was a beer or a bottle of something not far every second evening, and his camera. But by God, when he wasn't in the jail, he was out, and this was the thing which really grabbed me. He was out with the people, just like Niall O'Brien, Brian Gore, and Vincente, and the other 6. That's what was so different for me about this story. These guys were doing something to take on the sugar barons, which you heard about in Negros. And in one sense, it looked beautiful. These huge sugar fields and mountains, but beneath that, there was a tension. And as a young reporter going these places, you were never certain. Travelling the road to Cabancalan, at night, there was all you could get these little huts and little candles and little stoves at the side of the road. So I'd make these journeys up and down. And I know I stopped off someplace. Was it a Columban house someplace? We used to stay there to break the journey. And, I got to know Niall and Brian going to the prison. And, Niall O'Brien made me famous. Jesus, how he made me famous. Because every time somebody in Ireland rang, even when I wasn't there, he'd say, he's here. He's sitting at the end of my bed. But the whole thing was a stitch-up. I visited there 3 times. In January into February, I think I went back. I was there for St. Patrick's Day, and I'll never forget that, St. Patrick's Day. And these thousands of postcards from all over Ireland. That's why I say, 30 years on, many people have forgotten what it was. But this was a huge story, absolutely enormous story in Ireland. All over. It grabbed the people, everybody. In Australia, it was the same. I got to know so many Australians. The Australia, RT was there, the Evening Herald was there, Joe Mulholland and Joe Little went there on one occasion. There may be 1 or 2 other Irish reporters going in and out, and there were some people doing freelance for the Irish Times. But the Australian media, Bob Worth, Bruce Dover, Paul Lynham, there's so many of them. They were there all the time. And even when I was coming home, the Australians were rotating the people there to cover this because it was such a huge story in Australia. But on that Patrick's weekend, it was one of those times when I used to say Niall O'Brien, and to be honest, Niall O'Brien, there were times, and he looked really wrecked. Because despite, once I think they may have been able to walk out of the jail. They walked into it, if they really wanted it, but they weren't going to do that. They were standing up. They were standing up for social justice. That's what is so important about this story. It is an example of people standing up for social justice. And that's what they were doing. And, you know, you would see him Brian was a big man. Niall was slim and thin. You know, and really when he got a bit of a cough or a cold, and the perspiration in what I call this room, this cell, you know, he really sometimes looked absolutely drained and exhausted. But still he would have his hand around you. He might have something under his table, give you something in a drop of tea, or there was always something that was just there. He was encouraging all the time. And when you walked out and you come back the next day, they were still there. And you know, eventually, I'm not going through the one thing I will tell you, I'm trying to find the photograph. When the trial moved to Becolid, and this is not a joke, this is true. I was telling Donny, I will find it. There is a picture of the judge, and behind him there's one or two pictures of silence, but one of the pictures says, "Silence in court, sponsored by Pepsi Cola." Yeah, absolutely. Silence in court, sponsored by. In a way, it summed up. Everything that was happening in the Philippines. God, it was true. And you know, and such strange things. Witnesses getting up there, and some days you go in there. And for me, it was hard because I was trying to report back to Ireland. The time difference was enormous, and it was. You know, we were begging and scraping because RT didn't have many facilities, so I would use an Australian camera crew to do a piece to camera. You'd go to a phone and try and, we used to break phones up, and we had things called crocodile clips, and we'd send the report back to Dublin on a shaky phone line. I can remember one occasion, over the Patrick's weekend, I did a radio, because I was doing radio as well. I did a 7 or 8 minute radio report, and I went to some place with Frankie in Becolid to try and feed this tape back to Dublin, and it took about 20 goes. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and but still you wanted to do it. You know, in one sense, you know, maybe I lost a little bit of my journalistic impartiality because, you know, I was wearing a green jersey. Whatever about a Columban collar, I was certainly wearing our Redemptorist collar, but I have to tell you, as I said, Columbans and Redemptorists, and not only that, but I met some, I'm trying to remember their names, Columban and presentation sisters who were there, in and out, and they were fantastic. But eventually, you know, the story developed, and it was pressure by people across the world. It wasn't the politicians, it was people power. Standing up, standing with the Negros Nine, that eventually put pressure on the Americans and on Ronald Reagan, who was coming to Ireland. I was actually in Galway. I covered Ronald Reagan's visit to Ireland, and I was doing it from Galway. And when I was there on the night after he arrived, the news started to break that there was something going to happen, and then it eventually took, you know, also a couple of weeks. But it was, you know, that was the pressure. But it was people pressure. It was the pressure of Mrs. O'Brien standing in her cell in town, you know, just really going for it. So, what can I say? It should be marked in a bigger way. It really should. It should be marked in a much bigger way. Because it is, as I said at the outset, I'm not a religious person. I mean this in the nicest way. But I absolutely, and I say this in the same sense, missionary priests and nuns. I have lots of friends, believe you me, all over the world. I'm going to tell you one story. I met a Kiltegan father in South Africa, a young guy, and he's the mission for justice and peace. He's a fantastic character, absolutely fantastic. But I met him when I went to South Africa. Up to his oxters in social justice. Now, a story about the nun in Zaire, which had me in a pulpit. And they're the people. You know, and I go to the Angus and Jack Finucane, the Concern, you know, fathers. Brilliant. South America, when I was there, I went to a couple of places, and with missionary. And I know I met a missionary priest. I think he's from one of the orders out there earlier, and he's down there. He's hiding. But you know, again, I met a guy out there who was in the outback, riding a horse. He was as Irish as you met, and he was, again, all he was involved in was helping in social justice. So, you know, we need to, whatever's happened, it's not just Niall O'Brien, Brian Gore, and the rest of them. It was something really important in our lives. And, you know, that's all I can say. Believe you me, I'm happier to be here tonight than you know, because you are absolutely fantastic. The Columbans, dare I say it, are relentless. I say to people, he was one of my best friends. Brian Gore and Niall O'Brien came to my house a few years afterwards. They were back, you know, I was living in Bray at the time, and met my daughter Orla and Nessa, and they were around, and you know, they're just such, Brian Gore, such a character, you know, larger than life. And then Niall's, you know, absolutely, I wasn't covering, I think Joe Little covered it, but I wouldn't have missed, I mean, to be there for Niall O'Brien. And when I asked Joni the other day about Frankie Conlon, you know, his family had a house just at Dublin Airport. And every time I fly in and fly out, a lot of times, I always think of Frankie, because that's where his farm, the farm was there, and everything about him. And you know, I would love to have paid tribute to him, if, you know, I didn't know at the time. But when I asked Tony, he had passed away. But he symbolised for me, as did Niall and Brian, you know, all that is good, all that is brilliant. And all I can say is thank you very much for letting me be.